What would you do if a $5 junk purchase turned your life upside down? Sarah was a struggling hotel maid, drowning in debt. When she bought a rusted abandoned train car for the price of a cup of coffee, she expected a simple DIY salvage project. Instead, she unearthed a terrifying secret that had the FBI breaking down her door. The Wyoming wind howled across the desolate expanse of the Cheyenne Municipal Salvage Yard, kicking up clouds of stinging red dust that coated the rows of discarded machinery. Sarah Jenkins stood near the back of the small crowd, pulling her thin denim jacket tighter around her shoulders. At 32, Sarah's life was defined by the relentless ache in her knees and the sharp smell of industrial bleach. She worked double shifts as a maid at the historic Plains Hotel, scrubbing porcelain and making beds for tourists, all to barely make a dent in the towering stack of medical bills her late mother had left behind. Sarah had a singular escape from her grueling reality, restoring forgotten things. On her rare days off, she scoured estate sales and junk yards for broken furniture, bringing discarded chairs and dressers back to life with sandpaper and a little elbow grease. It was a meager side hustle, but it kept her spirit afloat. That was the only reason she had come to the county surplus auction on a bitter Tuesday morning. She was looking for vintage brass fixtures, or perhaps an old oak desk she could flip for a quick $100. The auctioneer, William Henderson, a stout man with a booming voice and a sweat-stained Stetson, was losing his patience. The lot they were standing in front of was an absolute eyesore. It was a 1924 Pullman sleeper car, severely rusted, its deep green paint peeling away in jagged scabs. Half of its windows were shattered, and the heavy iron wheels had sunk deep into the overgrown weeds. It had been sitting on a forgotten spur of track at the edge of the city limits for over 4 decades, abandoned after the railway company went bankrupt and the city claimed the land. "All right, folks, lot 409, William bellowed into his crackling megaphone. "You know the drill. Buyer is responsible for moving the item off city property within 30 days. Do I hear $1,000? Silence. The crowd of scrap metal dealers and local farmers chuckled. Moving a 40-ton hunk of rusting iron would require specialized heavy machinery cranes and flatbed trucks, a logistical nightmare that would cost upwards of $10,000. The scrap metal wasn't even worth half that. $500, William pleaded, wiping his brow. "Come on, there's good vintage steel in there. Someone give me $100. Still nothing. The crowd began to disperse, completely uninterested in the financial trap. William sighed, dropping the megaphone to his side. "All right, I'm practically giving it away. Do I hear $10? "I've tattoos anyone." Sarah stared at the train car. Through the shattered glass of the sleeper cabin, she caught a glimpse of something the scrappers had missed: solid Honduran mahogany paneling, vintage brass lighting sconces, and ornate iron luggage racks. If she could just get inside and strip the interior over the next 30 days, she could sell the antique fixtures to architectural salvage companies in Denver for thousands. The city only cared that the property was cleared. If she stripped it bare, she could surrender the empty metal shell to the scrapyard later. Before her rational mind could stop her, Sarah raised her numbered paper plate. William's eyes snapped toward her, wide with disbelief. "Sold to the young lady in the back for $5. The crowd turned to stare at her, a mix of pity and amusement on their faces. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She handed over a crumpled $5 bill at the clerk's folding table, signing a dense stack of liability waivers. The clerk, a tired woman named Beatrice, handed Sarah a heavy, rusted brass key. "Honey, you just bought yourself a whole lot of nothing," Beatrice muttered. "Watch out for tetanus." That evening, after finishing a grueling 10-hour shift at the hotel, Sarah drove her battered Ford pickup truck out to the edge of town. The salvage yard was completely deserted, illuminated only by the pale light of a half-moon. She brought a flashlight, a crowbar, a tool belt, and a thermos of black coffee. The train car loomed in the darkness like the ribcage of some prehistoric beast. Inserting the heavy brass key into the rusted lock of the rear vestibule door, Sarah had to throw her entire body weight against the heavy iron to force it open. The hinges screamed in protest, a harsh, metal-on-metal shriek that echoed across the empty plains. As she stepped inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew, decaying velvet, and decades of trapped heat. Sarah clicked on her flashlight, sweeping the beam across the narrow corridor. Despite the exterior rot, the interior was remarkably well preserved. Dust hung in the air like snow settling on the rich dark wood of the sleeper cabins. The intricate brass handles on the sliding doors were tarnished to a dull brown, but Sarah knew they would polish up beautifully. She walked down the narrow aisle, her boots crunching softly on the ruined carpet. The car had 6 compartments. She entered the last, one-room F, which was situated directly over the rear axles. It was slightly larger than the others, perhaps once reserved for wealthy railway barons. As she ran her hand over the mahogany paneling, calculating how carefully she would need to pry it off her boot, caught the edge of a brass floor grate. Sarah stumbled, dropping her flashlight. It rolled under the sleeper berth, its beam illuminating a strange, unnatural gap in the wooden floorboards beneath the bed. Sarah knelt down, retrieving the light. She pressed her hand against the floorboards. They didn't feel solid like the rest of the car. There was a hollow, echoing resonance when she tapped her knuckles against the wood. Her brow furrowed. Train cars were built with solid metal undercarriages. There should be no hollow space between the floorboards and the steel chassis. Curiosity taking over, she pulled her crowbar from her tool belt and wedged the flat edge into the tight seam between the oak planks. The first plank resisted, stubbornly held in place by rusted iron nails that had fused with the wood over decades of dampness. Sarah gritted her teeth, leaning her entire weight onto the steel crowbar. Her muscles burned exhausted from a day of scrubbing, but the thrill of discovery pushed her forward. With a loud, violent crack, the wood splintered, and the old nails screeched as they were ripped from their housings. Sarah tossed the heavy plank aside, sending a fresh cloud of ancient dust into the stagnant air. She shone her flashlight into the dark void she had just exposed. It was a false floor, a custom-built cavity lined with zinc to prevent moisture, measuring roughly 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. Her breath hitched in her throat. The cavity wasn't empty. Nested tightly within the hidden compartment were 4 heavy, olive-drab canvas duffel bags. They were military-grade, sealed with thick leather straps and heavy brass padlocks that had gone green with oxidation. Beside the bags lay a small, battered leather briefcase, its edges worn soft by time. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached down into the dark recess. The canvas was stiff and brittle, shedding flakes of dried rot as she grabbed the handle of the nearest bag. She hauled it up onto the dusty mattress of the sleeper berth. It was incredibly heavy, weighing at least 40 pounds. She retrieved a heavy pair of bolt cutters from her truck, her mind racing with wild possibilities. Tools, contraband, old railway equipment. She snapped the brittle brass padlock with a sharp squeeze of the cutters. The lock clattered to the floor. Sarah unbuckled the stiff leather straps and pulled the canvas wide. The flashlight beam caught the contents, and Sarah's heart completely stopped. Neatly stacked inside, wrapped in wax paper, and bound with brittle rubber bands were bricks of cash. But this wasn't modern currency. They were stacks of large-sized bills, the kind that hadn't been printed in nearly a century. She reached out her fingers, brushing the dry, crisp paper of the top stack. They were gold certificates. Series 1928, $1,000 and $10,000 denominations, featuring the stern faces of Grover Cleveland and Salmon P. Chase. The sheer volume of paper was staggering. Sarah quickly tore open the other 3 bags, abandoning any sense of caution. More cash. Stacks upon stacks of it. Interspersed among the paper money were heavy canvas pouches that clinked with the unmistakable muffled sound of solid metal. She opened one to find it filled with gleaming, perfectly cast gold bullion bars, each stamped with a crude serial number. She was staring at millions of dollars, a fortune that had been buried in the floorboards of a forgotten train car for God knows how long. Panic, sudden and suffocating, seized her chest. People didn't just forget about this kind of money. This wasn't a misplaced wallet. This was a war chest. This was blood money. Her eyes darted to the battered leather briefcase sitting at the bottom of the cavity. Swallowing hard, she pulled it up. The latch wasn't locked. It popped open with a dull click. Inside there was no money. Instead, there was a single thick leather-bound ledger and a manila envelope. Sarah opened the envelope first. Black and white photographs slid out onto the mattress. They were surveillance photos. Candid shots of men in 1960s, tailored suits, shaking hands in dimly lit diners, exchanging briefcases on airport tarmacs, and standing near recognizable landmarks. But it was the final photograph that made the blood drain from Sarah's face. It was a clear, unmistakable picture of a young man stepping into a dark sedan. Sarah recognized him instantly. Everyone in the country knew that face. It was John Bradley, a notorious Union leader who had vanished without a trace in 1971, sparking one of the most massive, fruitless FBI manhunts in American history. Hands shaking violently, Sarah opened the ledger. The pages were filled with meticulous handwritten columns, dates, amounts, and names. Senator Reynolds, $50,000. Chief Inspector Davis, $100,000. Chicago Port Authority, $250,000. It was a master ledger of bribes, payoffs, and extortion money, directly tying some of the most powerful political figures of the mid-century to organized crime and the disappearance of John Bradley. This train car hadn't been abandoned by mistake. It was a mobile vault, a blackmail insurance policy hidden by someone who had likely been murdered before they could ever retrieve it. The heavy silence of the train car was suddenly broken by a sound that sent a jolt of pure ice down Sarah's spine. The crunch of gravel outside. Sarah instantly killed her flashlight, plunging the cabin back into absolute darkness. She held her breath, pressing her back against the mahogany wall. She listened intently. Someone was walking around the perimeter of the salvage yard. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and moving closer to car 409. She crept to the shattered window, keeping her head well below the sill, and peeked out through a jagged shard of glass. Parked near the chain-link fence, right next to her battered Ford pickup, was a sleek black SUV with heavily tinted windows. It had no license plates. A tall figure in a dark trench coat was standing by her truck, shining a high-powered tactical beam into its empty cab. Whoever owned the secrets in the floorboards hadn't forgotten about them. They had just been waiting for someone to finally buy the car and do the heavy lifting. Sarah looked back at the millions of dollars glowing faintly in the moonlight. She was trapped. If she ran, the man outside would see her. If she stayed, he would eventually come inside. She desperately reached into her pocket, pulling out her cheap, cracked smartphone. She had 1 bar of signal. She couldn't call the local police. The ledger had already warned her how deep the corruption used to run, and she had no idea if those roots still poisoned the local department today. There was only one agency equipped to handle something of this magnitude. Her trembling fingers dialed the regional field office of the FBI. The dial tone seemed to hum in Sarah's ear for an eternity before a crisp professional voice broke the silence. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Denver Field Office. Duty Officer Thomas. Speaking. How can I direct your call? Sarah pressed her hand fiercely over her mouth, trying to muffle the sound of her own ragged breathing. She huddled deeper into the dark corner of compartment F, her eyes locked on the narrow sliver of moonlight filtering through the broken window. "I need help," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "I'm at the Cheyenne Municipal Salvage Yard, Lot 409. I bought an old train car and I found something hidden inside. Millions in cash, gold, and a ledger." "Ma'am, I need you to speak up just a little," Officer Thomas replied, his tone shifting from bureaucratic to alert. "Did you say millions of dollars?" "Yes." Sarah gasped, shrinking down as the crunch of gravel outside grew louder. The man in the trench coat was now walking parallel to the train car, his heavy boots moving with a slow, predatory rhythm. "And surveillance photos. There's a picture of John Bradley, the union boss who disappeared. The ledger has names of senators, police chiefs. Please, there is a man outside right now. He has a flashlight. He's looking for a way in." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The mention of the Bradley case, one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in American law enforcement history, instantly escalated the situation. "What is your name, ma'am?" "Sarah. Sarah Jenkins." "Okay, Sarah. I am dispatching a regional SWAT unit and the Wyoming Highway Patrol to your exact location right now. They are 10 minutes out. I need you to stay perfectly quiet and stay hidden. Do not confront this individual. Can you lock the compartment door?" "It's a sliding door," Sarah whispered, tears of pure terror pricking her eyes. "The lock is busted. The brass is entirely stripped." "All right. Find a weapon, but only use it if he discovers you. Stay on the line with me." Outside, the heavy footsteps stopped. Sarah held her breath. A harsh, white beam of light suddenly pierced the gloom, sweeping through the shattered windows of the adjacent compartment. The man was right outside her section of the train. He muttered something under his breath, a low, gravelly curse. Then came the sound of metal scraping against metal. He was at the rear vestibule door, the same one Sarah had forced open an hour earlier. Because the rusty hinges were already broken, the heavy iron door didn't shriek this time. It simply groaned as it was pushed open. The heavy thud of a tactical boot stepping onto the wooden floorboards echoed down the narrow corridor. Sarah's blood ran cold. She quietly placed her phone on the dusty mattress, ensuring the speaker was facing up so Officer Thomas could hear, and reached for the heavy steel crowbar she had used to pry open the floor. She gripped it with both hands, her knuckles turning white. The man was moving methodically down the aisle, his flashlight beam slicing through the thick, dusty air. He wasn't rushing. He moved with the terrifying confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. As he passed each compartment, he kicked the sliding doors open, checking the interiors. Bang, bang, bang. He was getting closer. Sarah realized with a sickening jolt that hiding in the corner wouldn't work. The moment he flashed his light into compartment F, he would see the ripped floorboards, the open canvas bags spilling over with gold certificates. And then he would see her. She had seconds to make a decision. Above the sleeper berth was a narrow secondary luggage loft, a tight, dark alcove, meant for storing heavy steamer trunks. It was barely 2 feet high, covered in decades of cobwebs and soot. Without hesitating, Sarah climbed onto the mattress, wincing as the old springs squeaked faintly, and hoisted herself up into the suffocatingly tight space. She dragged her legs in, just as the heavy sliding door of compartment F was shoved violently open. The flashlight beam hit the floor. The man stopped dead in his tracks. From her vantage point, staring through a narrow gap in the wooden trim, Sarah could see the top of his head. He was wearing a dark wool fedora and a thick coat. He slowly lowered his flashlight, illuminating the shattered floorboards and the sea of wealth scattered across the lower mattress. "Well, I'll be damned," the man murmured. His voice was raspy, laced with a thick Chicago accent. He reached into his coat and pulled out a suppressed handgun, keeping it leveled at the shadows as he stepped fully into the room. He didn't care about the gold. He didn't even look at the stacks of $1,000 bills. His eyes darted frantically around the cabin until they landed on the battered leather briefcase sitting open on the mattress. He holstered his weapon and lunged for the ledger. As his fingers brushed the worn leather, the distinct wailing shriek of multiple police sirens pierced the quiet night. The man froze his head, snapping toward the window. The flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen squad cars were already painting the salvage yard in chaotic strokes of color. "Damn it," he snarled. He shoved the ledger and the envelope of photographs into his coat, entirely ignoring the millions in cash and gold. He turned to run, but his heavy boot caught on the jagged edge of the torn mahogany floorboard. He stumbled, pitching forward, and his shoulder slammed hard against the brass framing of the sleeper berth. Sarah knew that if he escaped with the ledger, the truth would disappear forever. Adrenaline, raw and burning, flooded her veins. As the man scrambled to his knees directly beneath the luggage loft, Sarah tightened her grip on the heavy steel crowbar. She didn't think. She just swung. The heavy steel crowbar connected with a sickening resonant thud against the man's collarbone. He let out a sharp, breathless cry of absolute agony, the force of the blow dropping him to his knees. The leather-bound ledger slipped from his trembling fingers, tumbling back onto the dust-choked floorboards of compartment F. Desperate and enraged, he blindly reached up his thick fingers, wrapping violently around Sarah's ankle. He yanked with all his remaining strength, attempting to drag her down from the narrow luggage loft. His nails dug painfully through her denim jeans, scraping against her skin. "Let go of me!" Sarah screamed, her voice tearing through the stale air. Operating purely on a surge of primal adrenaline, she kicked out fiercely with her free leg. The reinforced steel toe of her heavy work boot connected squarely with his jaw, a brutal impact that sent him reeling backward. He crashed into the mahogany paneling of the narrow corridor, dazed and struggling to remain conscious. Before the intruder could recover his bearings and draw the suppressed handgun hidden in his coat, the pitch-black exterior of the salvage yard was obliterated by a wall of blinding high-intensity spotlights. "FBI, drop your weapon and step out of the vehicle with your hands in the air." A voice boomed over a mechanized loudspeaker, the sheer volume vibrating the rusted metal ribs of the old Pullman car. The cacophony of barking police dogs, slamming car doors, and shouting tactical units filled the Wyoming night. The man blinked against the harsh, strobing red and blue lights flooding through the shattered windows. He looked down at the invaluable ledger resting on the floorboards, just inches from his boots, then glanced at the laser sights painting the corridor wall. Weighing his impossible odds, he unleashed a string of violent, breathless curses. He abandoned the book, raised his hands in defeat, and stumbled out the rear vestibule door into the waiting rifles of the regional SWAT team. Inside the cabin, Sarah collapsed back against the soot-stained wall of the loft, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She pulled her knees to her chest, gasping for air. It took Special Agent David Miller, a calm, grey-haired veteran of the Bureau, with a steady voice, nearly 15 minutes to coax her down from the cramped space. When she finally descended, clutching the ledger to her chest, as if her life depended on it, she handed it over to Miller, like a sacred, cursed artifact. "You did good, Sarah. You survived," Agent Miller said, gently wrapping a thick, crinkling foil emergency blanket around her shivering shoulders. "You have absolutely no idea what you just blew wide open." The immediate aftermath was a chaotic, terrifying whirlwind of intense interrogations, protective custody protocols, and strict media blackouts. For 3 agonizing weeks, Sarah was housed in a highly secure federal safe house outside of Denver, while a specialized FBI forensic team meticulously dismantled Car 409 piece by piece. The historical and criminal revelations that followed were staggering. The man Sarah had fought off was definitively identified as Dominic Vitti, the ruthless grandson of a prominent enforcer for the Chicago outfit. His grandfather had operated as a primary fixer under infamous mid-century mob bosses. Vitti had been tipped off about the car's general location by a dying relative's confession and had come to Wyoming to destroy the damning evidence before it saw the light of day. The ledger proved to be exactly what it appeared to be: the ultimate blackmail vault. Its yellowed pages detailed an extensive, deeply entrenched network of corruption that bridged the gap between organized crime and the highest echelons of government. Most critically, it provided the exact geographic coordinates of John Bradley's shallow grave in an abandoned Nevada copper mine, finally bringing closure to a 50-year-old national mystery. Furthermore, the FBI confirmed that the gold bullion had been stolen from a Federal Reserve transport train in 1934, a brazen heist orchestrated by the very police captains and politicians listed in the ledger's meticulous payoff columns. But for Sarah, the grueling ordeal was far from over. While the FBI rightfully seized the stolen gold bars and the blackmail ledger as crucial evidence in multiple ongoing historical and criminal investigations, the status of the canvas bags filled with gold certificates became a viciously contested legal battleground. The cash totaling nearly $4 million in face value had technically been abandoned property. The federal government immediately attempted to seize the antique currency under sweeping civil asset forfeiture laws, claiming it was illicit contraband. However, Sarah wasn't just a tough, calloused hotel maid. She was resourceful, and she was done being stepped on. She hired a ruthless high-profile property rights attorney from Denver on a contingency basis. In court, her legal team masterfully argued that Sarah had legally purchased Lot 409 at a city-sanctioned auction, as is with all contents included, legally transferring ownership of the abandoned property to her. Furthermore, since the statute of limitations on the original 1930s crimes had expired over half a century ago, they argued the cash could not be retroactively seized as active criminal proceeds. The high-stakes legal battle raged for 8 exhausting months, dominating national news broadcasts and front-page headlines. The American public fiercely rallied behind Sarah. She became a folk hero, the struggling working-class woman who had single-handedly taken down a historical mob empire and was now courageously fighting the bureaucratic greed of the federal government. Finally backed into a severe public relations corner and facing immense pressure from sympathetic lawmakers, the Department of Justice offered a binding settlement. They would retain the physical gold certificates to be preserved by the Smithsonian Institution and the National Archives, formally acknowledging their immense historical and cultural value. In exchange, the government awarded Sarah a comprehensive finder's fee and an undisputed salvage settlement totaling $6, $5 million entirely tax-free. The Tuesday morning, the settlement officially cleared her bank account. Sarah walked through the grand brass doors of the Plains Hotel for the very last time. She didn't wear her bleach-stained maid's uniform. She calmly handed her written resignation to her stunned manager, immediately paid off the crushing entirety of her late mother's medical debt, and walked back out into the bright, boundless Wyoming sunlight. She purchased a sprawling, quiet ranch nestled deep in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains, complete with a massive climate-controlled workshop. She still spent her quiet days restoring forgotten things, bringing broken antique furniture back to life with sandpaper and stain, but she never had to worry about the cost of a cup of coffee or a $5 auction bid ever again. Sarah's unbelievable $5 gamble proves that history isn't just buried in textbooks. Sometimes it's hidden right under our feet in the most unexpected places. From crushing debt to uncovering a massive mob conspiracy and fighting the federal government for her rightful treasure, her story is the ultimate real-life thriller. If this incredible tale of bravery, corruption, and hidden fortune kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and make sure to subscribe. Ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into history's greatest mysteries. What would you have done if you found the ledger? Let us know in the comments below.